Even though it doesn't appear in the textbook in your class, I do want to talk about street art. Now, street art is a whole new form. It's something that has only found acceptance really since about 2000 in the art world, and is making the transition, or some of it is making the transition from low art, or arguably vandalism, and we'll get into that issue in a minute, into high art. And I'm looking at people like you, Banksy. Now, street art is arguably a perfectly democratic form. You don't have to pay to see it. You don't have to get into a gallery to see it. You don't have to be wealthy to see it. It will simply appear. And common forms, of course, include spray paint graffiti, stencil graffiti, and other forms. The importance here is that it is seen as democratic, not just because it's free to view, but because the artist is, in theory, not doing it for profit, but rather doing it mysteriously in the middle of the night to pass on a message. This gives the artist power. It's almost this Robin Hood idea, where the artist can get out a message and is willing to do so without being somehow paid for it. Now, that is important because if we look at it that way, the anonymous artist becomes that much more powerful. We start to look at the image, we start to dissect the image almost as if it were an academic article, as if it were a great piece of literature. And many of these pieces are going to be famous for using ideas from commercial art, such as getting across the message very, very rapidly, and using it in this sort of street art / high art setting. In this case, you can see that this piece is being painted over a wall that was already graffitied. So it raises a lot of issues, but yet there's a lot of great street art out there. And as I said, there are different types. We have, for example, installations, which we see here. We see wheat paste cutouts or stickers are very, very common. We see stencil work. This is very common, and actually the trick to it is frequently to use stencils set on a screen, but that's a whole different issue. We have wheat paste posters that are applied to walls, and there are other forms such as yarn bombing and other forms that are out there. So when we look at street art, what we have is art that can be as powerful as many of the great pieces that we've looked at in this course. For example, this piece, One Nation Under CCTV, mounted or painted right next to that camera, gets across the same sort of signaling, the same sort of message and anti-governmental propaganda, getting out this very specific idea that we see from David's Death of Marat, which gets out the idea of Marat as a martyr. So what we're seeing are powerful images using different ideas, different techniques to create the same basic idea. The difference is, in David's time, you wanted a slow burn. You want someone to stand in front of your painting and consider all of those different elements. When we move into the modern world, things are much faster paced, and the artist feels the need to get their message across in 5 seconds or less. If you can't read it and get through it in 5 to 10 seconds, then it will fail. And this makes the imagery arguably more powerful. Now let's deal with that issue of, is street art vandalism? And I'm going to make a very specific argument that it's not, or, well, sort of. Let's see. When we look at it, it kind of comes down to the idea of ownership. If a piece of street art is done on your neighbor's house, you might see it as art. If it's done on your house, it's kind of different, and it depends on what that street art looks like. Look at this building. Many of us would argue that this is clearly a ruined building. They have to clean up all that stonework, look at all the spray paint and the posters and everything else. But if you start to dig in closer, you could pick out elements that could be considered artistic, such as this sheep's head that's been painted in, perhaps, maybe the eye that's here. Different elements may be considered artistic, while others are considered graffiti, and this is very, very subjective. It kind of comes down to the viewer. Now, in some cases, it becomes a little more obvious. For example, if I'm the owner of this piece, of this property, and this happens to be Banksy, I'm probably going to be thrilled because that means that that painting, that wall is suddenly worth a lot more. My property maybe is worth a lot more, despite the fact that he ruined part of my sign that said parking, because I want people to park there. So you get the idea. It becomes a very nuanced argument. It also depends on what you're using. If you're doing street art with chalk on walls, sort of a Keith Haring idea, then, well, you're probably not going to get in very much trouble. If you're using spray paint, that may be another issue because it's a lot more difficult to remove. So it depends on the medium that you're using. It depends on what you're doing. It depends on who you are, and depends on the owner and their subjective view of whatever you've created. So at the end of the day, street art is a very subjective area. It's an area where art historians do not agree on what is street art and what is graffiti. Many of us draw the line in one extreme or the other. Some are more centered. Some are, let's see what it is. But it's an important element of the art world, and one that is taking more and more attention in this new, fragmented, individualized art world in which we live.